For this video, we will do an in-depth review of MFA. First, we will go through the MFA methods that FusionAuth actually supports, in addition to the various login policies and configurations. We will also cover how your end users can self-manage MFA for themselves with our self-service account pages. And then lastly, we'll cover best security practices when protecting sensitive pages in your own application with our step-up auth workflow. So first thing that we'll cover is how to configure FusionAuth for MFA. FusionAuth supports email, SMS, TOTP, MFA. So those are all configured in the tenant for FusionAuth. So let's go there first. And we'll go to our default tenant. So if we click on here, multi-factor, this is where you would set up your configuration for MFA within your FusionAuth instance. So like we covered before, FusionAuth supports Authenticator apps like TOTP, for TOTP, such as Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Duo, whatever supports being able to consume a secret generated by FusionAuth, we definitely can provide that. So that's pretty straightforward as far as enabling that within FusionAuth. We also do support email. So that would be configured where a challenge will be sent to the user's email address. Before you configure that, you would need to set up your SMTP server, and that's configured at the email setting within the tenant. So before any test emails or two-factor emails can go out, in addition to forgot password flows as well, since we've covered this as well, we would want to make sure that this is configured. If we go back to MFA within our tenant here, we do also have the ability to enable SMS. So SMS is going to be handled by a third-party provider, and FusionAuth can consume that and pass two-factor codes through that SMS provider. So how that is configured through is what's called a messenger through FusionAuth. So if we go to settings, we click on messengers, you have the ability to configure two different types of messengers within FusionAuth. One is we have a native Twilio messenger, where this should be information that you should be able to know how to configure. If not, please refer to our documentation. But essentially, you would grab the account SID auth token from Twilio, and that way you would have that configured, and you can name this whatever that you wish. Additionally, if you have a different SMS provider that is not supported by not Twilio, I may say, you could also set up what's called a generic messenger. So if you need more guidance on that, please refer to our documentation on how to do so. So if we go back to our tenant configuration, let's cover login policies for MFA. So FusionAuth supports 3 different policies that, depending on your use case, may fit for your users. So this dropdown here has 3 options. One is disabled. That's obviously if you want MFA completely turned off for that tenant, you can do so. And then there's 2 other configurations for the login policy: enabled. That's the most common use case, meaning that any user that actually has an MFA method available on their user object, that will be enabled by FusionAuth and a challenge will be presented. If there's another use case where you want to force MFA for all users within a tenant or a namespace, then you have the ability to set that login policy to required. The user would be forced to turn on and configure a MFA method. So that is our login policies. If we go to our advanced tab here, we do also have some configurations that would reference to 2FA as well. For example, if we scroll down to the two-factor trust option right here, this gives you the ability to force users to use essentially 2FA more often. So the default settings within the tenant for the two-factor trust is set to 30 days, which is, I believe that number is 2.5 million seconds approximately. So you have the ability to augment that to if you want to lock down the ability for users to be able to be forced to use that second factor more often, you can do so. And let's say if we wanted to change that to 7 days instead of 30 days where it's at currently. So you can do that, and I have this already set up, but 604,800 is the default for 7 days. So if we were to hit save, and let's see if that was enabled. So I'm going to go ahead and log out. I already have MFA configured for my own user account. So if we click on a WebAuthn method to log in, As you can see here, I am challenged with a email. And if we were to pull that up here, I have the code there. And now by default, this is set to 30 days, but now I have the option to, if I want to trust this device, I can simply check this and I will not be challenged again for the next 7 days before I'm set up to set up a second factor again. Those are a lot of settings that we have available to configure MFA. However, maybe there's a use case for your business where you might have multiple applications that your users log into. And let's say out of those multiple applications or products that your users log into, maybe there's a scenario that one of your applications you want less friction, or maybe you don't want MFA enabled at all on a certain application. Well, you have the ability to override MFA configurations at the application level. So applications within FusionAuth just represent something that a user can physically log into. And that might be a one-to-one mapping with your own product. So for example, if we click on one of our test app configurations here, we have the ability to override login policies at the application level, which would override the tenant configuration. So potentially you could have no configurations for MFA at the tenant, but per application, you can set up custom login policies based on your use case. Additionally, if we click on this advanced tab, you also have the ability to override the two-factor trust settings, and that goes on to essentially locking down your application a little bit further. So example, 600, if you want to be able to set that for 7 days, you can put that to 604,800. And instead of that set it up at the tenant level, that'll be override at the application level. Awesome. So that is the login policies and configurations for MFA. What if you want to give your users the ability to manage MFA for themselves? Well, you can absolutely do that with a concept that we have called self-service account pages. So self-service account pages are set at the application level, and this is a URL that you pass that has a specific application ID scoped to the application that your users want to be able to manage various configurations, whether that's their password, personal details. But for the purpose of this video, we will just cover how we can manage MFA methods for the individual user. So if we click on this view option for one of our test apps, if we scroll down, we have this account URL. So let's copy and paste this account URL. Okay, so this is our self-service account pages located here. And for the purposes of this video, let's show you how easy it is to set up a TOTP configuration. So as you can see here, I already have a email method set up, but let's say I want to add an Authenticator app or TOTP. So I can select from this drop down here what method I want to select. And from here, I can take whatever application that can consume a secret, and I can be able to add that as a method for 2FA for FusionAuth. So luckily here, I already have my 1Password password manager, and that allows me to actually scan a QR code. So I was able to set up a one-time password, and if we enable that, we now have a Authenticator app successfully configured for the application. So if we go back and let's log out of our admin UI, and we'll show you how that is set up now. So I'm selecting a passkey. Now I am getting hits with a second challenge. Now I have the ability to choose email or a TOTP challenge. We'll just do the TOTP, and we are set that up here. And we successfully authenticated with a TOTP Authenticator app. Perfect. So the last thing that we wanted to cover is a common use case for a lot of businesses to increase better security posture. And what that workflow entails is what's called step-up auth or step-up authentication. So what would be the reasons for setting up this type of workflow? Well, potentially you might be in a business where certain sensitive data, potentially you're in finance, potentially you're in healthcare, and there may be certain pieces of data that you want to make sure that is protected, and only the user that can actually view that sensitive pages that you can actually authenticate them to make sure they are who they say they are. So that is a common use case where you would want to implement a step-off flow within your own application. Since this is out of the scope of what's a traditional login flow, this is something that you would handle within your own application by utilizing our APIs. Now, another way that you could look into implementing some type of security posture is you could potentially use some type of security questions that is challenged to the user. And a lot of customers and businesses have found that useful for their use case. However, security questions over the years have become more of a risk. And the reason being is security questions can typically be prone to phishing attacks. Depending on what type of questions that you are challenging to your user, could be easily guessed by other persons, depending on the use case. So being able to set up a step-up auth where a user essentially is getting hit with a challenge, whether that's from a Authenticator app or email or SMS, is generally widely considered a better security posture as far as accomplishing that use case of protecting sensitive data. So with this workflow with FusionAuth, you essentially have 2 steps with an optional third, depending on if you want FusionAuth to send the actual code to the user. First, when a user wants to access a protected page, you would simply call one of our endpoints called 2-factor/start, which generates a code and a 2-factor ID. From there, you would complete a second call to our 2-factor login endpoint to complete the authentication step up. So the user, before the user is actually authenticated, you obviously have to provide that code so the user can input that. So optionally, you can have FusionAuth send that code if they already have a 2-factor method enabled, or you can send that code directly through your own application, however you see fit. Once the user verifies and inputs that code, you would then send another request to FusionAuth with that code and a trust factor, 2-factor ID within the request to officially log in the user and complete the step-up challenge. Now, to show you kind of what that looks like, I actually have this configured within a Postman application, so we can just show you what that looks like. So once again, when you're starting that challenge, you want to look at our 2-factor/start documentation. This would all be located within our 2-factor APIs. Essentially, within the request, you want to make sure that you have the application ID for the user that is that the user is logged into. And essentially, you want to have the login ID that would be either the email address or username within the request. Once again, once you actually send that request, this is essentially the moment that a user hits that protected resource. You would get a response back with the code and the 2-factor ID. Now, if the user actually has 2FA enabled, you have the ability to optionally send the code via one of those 2-factor methods by utilizing FusionAuth. However, if a user doesn't have any 2-factor methods available, then you have the ability to actually send this code directly to the user. So let's copy and paste this 2-factor ID, and let's assume that the user has received the page that you sent them, and now they are getting ready to enter the code that you sent them within the app. So once we have the request set up and the user inputs that code, we get a successful response back with the access token and the user object populated in the response. Awesome. So that is the workflow for the step-up authentication and MFA. Thanks for watching this video. If you have further questions, please reach out. Hope this helps. Thanks.